A man rescues a bear from a swamp. What happens next will shock you. The wind howled through the towering pines, sweeping across the frozen marshland where Jack Morgan trudged through knee-deep snow. The fading light of day cast long shadows across the wilderness, painting the sky in hues of violet and orange. He had set out that morning to check his traps, hoping for a decent catch before the worst of winter settled in. Life in the mountains was relentless, demanding endurance and patience, qualities Jack had long since mastered. Yet nothing in his years of solitude had prepared him for what he would encounter that evening. As he neared the edge of the swamp, a sound cut through the wind, a low, guttural growl followed by frantic splashing. Jack froze, his gloved fingers instinctively tightening around the rifle slung over his shoulder. Something was struggling in the icy water, and by the weight of the sound, it was no small creature. He crept forward, boots crunching against frost-covered reeds, his breath visible in the frigid air. When he reached the clearing, his eyes widened. A massive grizzly bear was half submerged in the swamp, its powerful limbs tangled in a hunter's steel trap. The bear thrashed, its roars carrying through the stillness, sending crows fluttering from the trees. Blood darkened the water around it, staining the surface with deep crimson. Jack's pulse quickened. A grizzly in this state was unpredictable, wild with pain and fear, but something in the scene held him rooted. He had seen many animals fall to traps before, foxes, wolves, even deer, but never a bear. And never had he felt the sudden, inexplicable pull of urgency. His first instinct was to retreat. Common sense dictated he leave the beast to its fate. After all, nature had its own rules, and interfering with them often led to disaster. But as he looked into the bear's eyes, he hesitated. They were wide, filled with fury, but beneath that, Jack saw something else, a raw, desperate plea. The same look he had seen in men who had stared death in the face and knew they could not fight their way out. Jack inhaled sharply, pushing aside his fear. The choice had already been made the moment he stopped walking. Cautiously, he shrugged off his rifle and pack, stepping closer. The bear let out another warning growl, its body tensing, muscles straining against the freezing water. "Easy there," Jack muttered, his voice low and even. Though he doubted the bear could understand anything but the danger of his presence, his hands moved carefully as he retrieved a rope from his pack, knotting it into a loop. The trap was deep, the metal clamps embedded in the bear's leg. The injury looked bad, but if he could free the creature, maybe, just maybe, it would stand a chance. Jack waded into the water, suppressing a shudder as the cold bit through his layers. Each step was slow, deliberate, as he closed the distance. The bear's eyes followed his every move, its heavy breath steaming in the icy air. Closer now, Jack could see the raw wound, the torn flesh beneath thick fur. He clenched his jaw. Whoever set this trap had either been a fool or a coward. No one with any sense would place such a thing in a bear's territory unless they had planned to return for the kill. He looped the rope around the trap's chain, securing it to a sturdy fallen branch. Then, with the calculated precision of a man who had spent years battling the elements, he moved to loosen the mechanism. His fingers were numb, but he worked quickly, heart pounding. The moment the steel released, the bear roared, its massive body surging upward. Jack barely had time to react before the beast's paw lashed out. He stumbled back, falling hard against the frozen ground, his breath knocked from his lungs. For a moment, the world narrowed to nothing but the thunderous pounding of his own heartbeat. The bear was free, but whether it would flee or turn its rage on him was uncertain. Jack forced himself to remain still, muscles tense, ready for the worst. The grizzly stood, towering over him, panting heavily, its injured leg shaking beneath its own weight. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking, the bear staggered a few steps, its gaze still locked onto Jack's. A long, harrowing moment passed between them, an unspoken understanding forming in the cold silence. Jack remained motionless as the bear lowered itself onto its haunches, exhausted. Its breathing was ragged, eyes glassy from blood loss. The wild, primal fury that had filled them earlier was fading, replaced with something heavier, fatigue, pain, maybe even reluctant trust. Jack exhaled slowly. The fight had drained from the creature, leaving only the instinct to survive. The temperature was dropping fast, and Jack knew that if the bear remained out here in its condition, it wouldn't make it through the night. He weighed his options. Leaving the bear behind felt wrong after coming this far, but taking it with him was madness. And yet, as he watched the massive creature struggling to keep itself upright, he found himself reaching for his pack once more. He retrieved another length of rope and hesitated only briefly before securing it around the bear's injured leg, not too tightly, just enough to provide support. "Come on, big guy," he muttered, rising to his feet. The bear let out a deep, weary huff but did not resist as Jack pulled gently. Step by agonizing step, he guided the wounded animal toward his sled. His back screamed in protest from the effort, but he pressed on. The journey back to the cabin was grueling. Jack trudged forward, pulling the sled behind him, the weight of the massive bear slowing his every movement. The storm clouds above threatened snow, and by the time he reached the safety of the cabin, his limbs were trembling with exhaustion. Inside, he laid the bear onto a thick bed of furs near the hearth. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows along the walls as warmth seeped into the space. Jack removed his soaked coat, setting to work on the bear's wound. He cleaned the gash as best he could, binding it with strips of cloth. The bear stirred but did not fight him, too weak to protest. Finally, when all was done, Jack sat back against the wall, watching the bear's slow, steady breathing. His cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt different. The presence of another living being, even one as wild and dangerous as a grizzly, shifted something inside him. He had spent years pushing the world away, yet here he was, sharing his home with a creature that could end his life with a single swipe. And strangely, he didn't feel afraid. Outside, the wind howled, the forest stretching endlessly beyond his door. Inside, Jack and the bear lay in mutual silence, two survivors bound by circumstance. Neither of them knew what the coming days would bring, but one thing was certain: fate had woven their paths together in ways neither could yet understand. The first rays of morning crept through the cabin's frost-covered windows, casting a golden hue over the wooden walls. Jack Morgan stirred from his spot against the hearth, his back stiff from sleeping upright. The fire had burned low during the night, its embers glowing faintly beneath layers of ash. He blinked the sleep from his eyes and turned his gaze toward the bear sprawled across the furs. Brutus, he had decided to call him that in the dim hours before dawn, was still breathing, his massive chest rising and falling with deep, labored sighs. The crude bandages Jack had wrapped around his wound were soaked with dark, dried blood, but they held firm. The bear had not attempted to move much, which was likely a good thing. Jack exhaled, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension that had settled there. It had been years since he had shared his space with another living being, and now he had taken in a creature that could crush his skull with a single swipe. It was madness, but then again, isolation had never made him rational. He pushed himself to his feet, joints popping as he stretched. The fire needed tending, and the bear, if he was to recover, needed food. Jack moved quietly around the cabin, wary of waking his guest. He retrieved a slab of dried venison from his stores and set it by the hearth, cutting it into strips before placing some in a pot with water. A slow stew would be the best he could offer, though he doubted the bear had any interest in cooked meals. Raw meat would freeze too fast in this weather, and Jack had no intention of dragging a fresh kill inside just yet. As the scent of simmering broth filled the room, Jack glanced toward Brutus once more. The bear's eyes were open, watching him. There was no immediate hostility in that gaze, but there was no trust either, just caution. Jack met the stare and tilted his head slightly. "Well," he muttered, his voice rough from sleep. "You're not dead. That's a start." Brutus blinked slowly but did not react otherwise. Jack turned back to his work, ladling some broth into a wooden bowl before setting it a few feet away from the bear. He knew better than to approach too close now that Brutus was awake. He backed away, allowing space, and waited. The bear sniffed the air, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scent. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, with slow and deliberate movements, he shifted, testing the weight of his injured limb. A low rumble escaped his throat, but he pressed forward, dragging himself toward the bowl. Jack remained still, heart pounding, as Brutus dipped his snout into the warm broth and lapped at it cautiously. He did not finish it all, but he drank enough to ease some of his weakness. Jack took that as a small victory. The day moved slowly. Jack busied himself with chores, stepping outside to chop wood and check his snares while keeping an ear tuned to the cabin. Each time he returned, Brutus remained where he was, occasionally shifting but never making any attempt to rise fully. Jack wondered if the bear understood that movement would only worsen his condition or if he was simply too drained to fight anymore. Either way, the fragile truce between them remained intact. Snow had begun to fall again by the afternoon, light flurries dusting the evergreens surrounding the cabin. Jack sat by the fire, whittling away at a piece of wood, shaping it into nothing in particular. He had always found the motion soothing, a habit carried from childhood when his grandfather had taught him the craft. The steady scrape of the knife against wood filled the quiet. Brutus shifted suddenly, breaking the silence with a sharp huff. Jack tensed, hand hovering over the knife at his belt, but the bear only adjusted his position, his head now turned toward the door as if listening. Jack frowned. The wind had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the logs, but there was something else beneath it, a sound barely audible, distant but distinct. A howl. Jack's grip tightened on the blade. Wolves. He had seen their tracks near the river a few days ago, signs that a pack had moved into the area for winter. He had not expected them to come so close to his home. Another howl echoed through the trees, this one closer, followed by a series of short, sharp yips. They were communicating, hunting. Jack rose slowly, moving toward the window, peering into the white expanse beyond. The snowfall made visibility poor, but he could see shapes moving between the trees, shadows flitting in and out of sight. His gut twisted. A wounded bear, even one as large as Brutus, would be an easy target if the pack caught his scent. Jack reached for his rifle, ensuring it was loaded before moving toward the door. He hesitated, glancing back at Brutus. The bear had lifted his head fully now, ears twitching, golden eyes locked onto the window as if he too understood the danger lurking beyond. Jack debated his options. He could fire a warning shot, scare them off before they got any closer, but wolves were persistent, especially in winter. If they were hungry enough, they would wait. And if Brutus was too weak to defend himself, Jack wasn't sure he could do much more than buy time. A deep growl rumbled through the cabin, low and steady. Jack turned to see Brutus pushing himself upright, muscles straining with the effort. He barely managed to lift his front half, his injured leg trembling beneath his weight, but there was a fire in his eyes now, something wild and unbroken. Jack exhaled sharply. The bear wasn't just aware of the threat, he was prepared to fight. Jack had seen that same determination in wounded men before, in soldiers refusing to surrender even when the odds were stacked against them. It was a will to survive, to protect. Jack nodded to himself, gripping his rifle tighter. "All right then," he muttered. "Let's make sure they know this place ain't worth the trouble." He stepped outside onto the porch, boots crunching against fresh snow. The cold bit at his face, sharp and unrelenting. The wolves were closer now. He could see the lead animal, a large, silver-coated beast prowling near the tree line. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, hungry and calculating. Jack lifted his rifle and fired into the air. The crack of the shot split the night, sending birds scattering from the branches above. The wolves hesitated, ears flattening, bodies tensing. For a moment, Jack thought they might retreat. Then, to his dismay, the silver wolf took a slow step forward, its breath visible in the frigid air. A thunderous roar erupted from the cabin behind him. Jack startled, turning just in time to see Brutus force himself to his feet, his massive form filling the doorway. His injured leg buckled, but he caught himself, standing tall, eyes blazing with fury. The wolves immediately reacted. The silver leader froze, ears pinned back, tail lowering slightly. The others shifted uneasily, their confidence shaken. Brutus growled again, a deep, primal warning that reverberated through the trees. It was a sound that spoke of power, of dominance, a sound that made even the wild respect its place. The wolves hesitated for a few beats longer before, one by one, they turned and slunk back into the forest, vanishing like ghosts into the snow. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He lowered his rifle, glancing back at Brutus, who swayed slightly but remained standing. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jack understood, something unspoken had passed between them. Not gratitude, not trust, but acknowledgement. They had faced a threat together, and though Brutus had no reason to defend this place, he had made a stand. Jack gave a small nod. "Looks like we're not so different after all." The bear let out a weary huff, and as if that had been all the energy he could muster, he collapsed back onto the furs with a heavy thud. Jack smirked and stepped back inside, bolting the door against the cold. He tossed another log into the fire and took his seat once more. Outside, the forest remained still. Inside, man and beast shared the quiet, knowing that, for now at least, they had earned their peace. The storm rolled in by nightfall, thick snow descending in heavy, silent sheets that buried the world beyond Jack's cabin in an unbroken sea of white. The wind howled through the trees like a hungry thing, rattling the wooden walls, but inside, the fire crackled warm and steady. Jack sat in his usual place by the hearth, his boots propped against the stone ledge as he cleaned his hunting knife with slow, methodical strokes. Across the room, Brutus lay curled atop the thick pile of furs Jack had arranged for him, his massive form rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. The bear was healing, though slower than Jack would have liked. His leg remained stiff, the wound still an ugly mess beneath the bandages Jack changed daily, but the infection had not taken hold. That was something. Brutus was eating more, too, though he still eyed Jack warily every time food was placed before him, as if waiting for some hidden trick to be revealed. Jack had no tricks, just an instinct he had long since stopped questioning. The same instinct that had made him pull the bear from the swamp instead of leaving him to his fate. Outside, the storm raged on, and Jack knew he wouldn't be hunting for at least a few days. His supplies would last, but there was something else gnawing at him, something more than the bitter cold or the dwindling firewood. He had spent years alone by choice, carving out a life in these mountains, one built on solitude and the quiet hum of his own thoughts. But now, the cabin did not feel so empty. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He wasn't sure how he felt about any of this. Brutus stirred, letting out a low, rumbling groan before shifting onto his side. His eyes cracked open, glowing faintly in the dim firelight. Jack met the gaze, his fingers stilling over the knife handle. They watched each other in silence, neither man nor beast making a move. Then, slowly, deliberately, Brutus exhaled a long breath and closed his eyes again. Jack let out a short huff of air, shaking his head. "Well, at least you're getting comfortable," he muttered. The following morning, the world was buried in white. Jack stepped onto the porch, squinting against the brightness of the snow-covered landscape. The trees sagged under the weight, their branches dipping low, and the path leading toward the river was completely obscured. It would take hours of work to clear a trail, and even then, it would be slow. He tugged his coat tighter around his shoulders, exhaling sharply. No point in worrying about that now. He turned back toward the cabin and, through the window, caught sight of Brutus watching him. The bear's head was lifted slightly, ears perked, alert, but not aggressive. Jack hesitated, then opened the door, shaking the snow from his boots as he stepped inside. Brutus grumbled, stretching his limbs, though he still did not attempt to stand. His strength was returning, but the wound kept him tethered to the cabin, forced into an uneasy dependence that neither of them seemed fully comfortable with. Jack wasn't sure how much longer the bear would stay. Days? Weeks? There was no telling. But deep down, in some quiet, unspoken part of himself, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The storm lasted 3 more days, the wind never relenting, the snow piling higher against the windows until Jack was forced to shovel his way out just to reach the woodpile. Brutus remained inside, dozing for long stretches, stirring only to eat or to shift positions. The silence between them was no longer tense, but something else entirely. Something Jack couldn't quite put a name to. It wasn't until the 4th day that Jack realized just how much had changed. He had been outside splitting firewood when he heard it, a low, warning growl from within the cabin. Jack froze, axe poised mid-swing, his heartbeat quickening. He turned sharply, scanning the trees, searching for what had triggered the sound. Then he heard it, footsteps crunching through the snow. Slow. Deliberate. Not an animal. A man. Jack set the axe down carefully, reaching instead for his rifle. He moved toward the porch, silent, his breath a steady mist in the frigid air. The figure came into view a moment later, emerging from the trees, a man bundled in thick furs, a rifle slung over one shoulder. His face was obscured by a heavy scarf, but his posture, the way he carried himself, was enough to put Jack on edge. The stranger stopped a few paces away, tilting his head slightly. "Didn't expect to find anyone living this far out," he called, his voice muffled by the wind. Jack didn't lower the rifle. "Most don't." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Storm caught me off guard. Been tracking game through these parts." His eyes flicked toward the cabin. "Didn't figure I'd find company." Jack's grip tightened on the rifle. He knew men like this, men who wandered the wilderness not for survival, but for sport, for the thrill of taking what they pleased. And he had a sinking feeling that if the storm hadn't slowed him down, this man might have found Brutus before Jack had. "Not much company here," Jack said evenly. "Just me." The man didn't move for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough." But there was something in his expression, a lingering interest as his gaze shifted toward the cabin once more. Jack didn't like it. "I'd keep moving if I were you," Jack said, his tone sharpening just enough to cut through the cold. "Storms cleared, but the mountain don't take kindly to strangers." The man considered him, then smiled, an empty, knowing smile. "That so?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man chuckled again, shaking his head. "Well, I won't keep you then." He turned, stepping back toward the trees, pausing only once to glance over his shoulder. "Keep an eye on your traps," he said. "Lot of folks looking for easy pickings out here." Jack didn't lower his rifle until the man was gone, his form swallowed by the snow-laden forest. Only then did he exhale, rolling his shoulders as he turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Brutus was watching him. The bear had pushed himself upright, his ears flicked forward, his body tense in a way that made Jack think he had understood more than he should have. Jack sighed, setting the rifle down by the door. "Yeah," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I don't like him either." Brutus huffed, the sound deep and knowing. Jack moved to stoke the fire, but his mind was elsewhere. The stranger's words lingered in his thoughts, settling uneasily in his chest. "Lot of folks looking for easy pickings." Jack had spent years in these mountains without worry, without fear of what lurked beyond the trees. But now, with Brutus injured, with the fragile peace they had built, he found himself scanning the shadows a little more carefully. The bear wasn't the only one healing. And for the first time in years, Jack wasn't sure if solitude was something he wanted anymore. The snow had settled thick and deep across the mountains, turning the world into an endless white expanse. Jack woke before dawn, as he always did, the cold pressing against the walls of his cabin despite the steady glow of the fire. He moved with practiced efficiency, adding another log to the flames before pulling on his boots. His breath misted in the air as he stepped outside, the frost clinging to his beard. The silence of the forest was so absolute it was almost suffocating. Snow draped the trees, the sky still dark with the last remnants of night. He scanned the horizon, his eyes instinctively drifting toward the path where the stranger had disappeared days ago. There had been no further sign of him, no tracks near the cabin that didn't belong to Jack himself, but the words still lingered in his mind. "A lot of folks looking for easy pickings out here." Jack didn't trust easy words from hard men. He had met too many like that in his time, hunters who took more than they needed, men who saw the land as something to be conquered rather than respected. And he knew, with a quiet certainty, that if the stranger had caught sight of Brutus, the bear would have been nothing more than another prize, another trophy to be dragged back down the mountain. Jack tightened his grip on the hatchet in his hand, staring into the woods as if daring something to move. But nothing did. Just trees. Just snow. Just silence. He exhaled, shaking off the thought, and turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Brutus stirred at the sound of the door creaking open. The bear had grown stronger, though he still carried the stiffness of his injury, his leg healing but not yet whole. Jack had noticed the change in him, the way he watched the door now, the way his ears twitched at the distant sounds of the wilderness. There was an awareness in him, something beyond instinct, a recognition of the danger that lurked beyond their fragile truce. Jack set his hatchet down, brushing the snow from his shoulders. "Storm's done," he muttered, mostly to himself. But Brutus lifted his head slightly at the words. Jack smirked, shaking his head. "What, you understand English now?" Brutus huffed, shifting his weight, his massive body rustling the furs beneath him. Jack knew the bear was getting restless, the walls of the cabin pressing in on him the way they had once pressed in on Jack himself. He was healing, but he wasn't meant to stay here. The wild was calling him back. Jack saw it in the way Brutus stared at the window, his golden eyes distant, his breathing steady but heavy with something unspoken. Jack had always believed in letting things go when it was time, in understanding when to loosen his grip. But this was different. This wasn't a dog or a deer or some passing creature in need of temporary shelter. This was something else. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam curling in the cold air as he took a slow sip. He would have to hunt soon, not just for himself but for Brutus, who was eating more with each passing day. He had enough dried meat to last another week, maybe 2, but after that, the choice would have to be made. Would the bear stay, or would Jack send him back into the wild? He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The day passed in quiet work. Jack tended to the fire, reinforced the cabin walls where the wind had worn them thin, checked his rifle, his traps, his supplies. Brutus watched him with quiet interest, his eyes following every movement. Jack had never lived with another creature this way, had never spent this much time sharing space with something that wasn't human yet understood him in a way no man ever had. There was something in Brutus's gaze, something that didn't belong to an ordinary animal. Jack wasn't sure if it was intelligence or just the simple knowledge of survival, but whatever it was, it made him uneasy. As dusk settled over the mountains, Jack stepped outside once more, his rifle slung over his shoulder, the cold biting into his skin. He had no intention of going far, just far enough to scout the land, to make sure the stranger hadn't left anything behind that Jack should be wary of. The forest was still, the snow absorbing sound in that eerie way it always did. He moved carefully, stepping where the ice was firmest, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Then he saw them. Tracks. They weren't his, and they weren't the stranger's either. These were new, fresh. Wolf tracks, circling near the tree line, their pattern deliberate. Slow. Jack knelt, running his fingers through the disturbed snow. The wolves had come closer than before, close enough to scent the cabin, close enough to know something inside was worth watching. His stomach tightened. They hadn't attacked yet, but that didn't mean they wouldn't. A wounded bear, even one as large as Brutus, was still a bear in a vulnerable state. Jack clenched his jaw. He had no patience for scavengers. He rose, adjusting the grip on his rifle, and followed the tracks for a short distance. They weaved in and out of the trees, moving along the ridge before disappearing into the deeper woods. He could smell them faintly, the musk of fur and damp earth lingering in the crisp air. They had been close, but not reckless. Not yet. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his beard. He would have to be ready. By the time he returned to the cabin, darkness had fully settled, the fire inside flickering against the windows like a beacon. Brutus was awake, his ears twitching as Jack stepped through the door, the scent of the wolves still clinging to him. Jack set his rifle down, shaking his head. "We've got company," he muttered. Brutus didn't move, but his body tensed, his good leg pressing into the furs beneath him as if preparing to rise. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Don't worry. They won't come tonight. But he wasn't sure about tomorrow. That night, Jack sat by the fire, his knife in his hands, the quiet stretching between him and Brutus like something tangible. He knew what the wolves were waiting for. They were waiting for weakness, for an opportunity. They would come again, and when they did, Jack would be ready. He wasn't sure why he cared so much, why this mattered more than any other time he had fought off predators from his land. Maybe it was because this wasn't just about survival anymore. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't the only one left standing in the cold. Brutus shifted, letting out a slow, deep breath. Jack glanced at him, smirking slightly. "Guess we'll see what you're made of soon enough, huh?" The bear didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The fire burned low, the cabin warm despite the storm that whispered through the trees outside. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames, feeling something settle in his chest, a decision. A certainty. Whatever happened next, whatever the wolves tried to take, they wouldn't get what was his. Not this time. Not without a fight. The night stretched long and heavy, the weight of expectation pressing against the walls of the cabin. Jack didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, his rifle resting against his knee, the shadows flickering over the wooden walls. Outside, the wolves were waiting. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them, their presence a whisper in the wind, a tension in the air thick enough to taste. Brutus stirred beside him, his great body shifting on the furs, a deep, restless breath rumbling in his chest. The bear knew it too. There was no need for words, no need for anything but the quiet understanding that settled between them. A storm was coming. Not of snow or wind, but of blood and bone and survival in the way he had always understood it. This was about something deeper, something he hadn't let himself name. The wolves wanted Brutus. They wanted the weak, the wounded, the thing that did not belong. And Jack, against all reason, against all logic, had decided he would not let them have him. The first howl came just before dawn, splitting through the brittle air like a knife. Jack tensed, his eyes flicking toward the window. The sound was closer than before. Brutus raised his head, ears twitching, nostrils flaring as he scented the air. Jack stood, rolling his shoulders, cracking his neck. His muscles ached from the stillness, from the waiting, but he pushed it aside. The rifle was loaded. The knife at his belt was sharp. He moved to the door, pressing his palm against the rough wood, feeling the cold seeping through. The forest beyond was still, but it was not empty. The silence was the kind that came before a hunt, the kind that meant death was near. Jack opened the door. The cold hit him first, biting deep, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the cabin behind him. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped onto the porch, the sky above a deep, bruised shade of purple, the first hints of dawn bleeding through the trees. Then he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Watching. Waiting. The wolves were gathered at the tree line, their dark shapes barely distinguishable from the shadows they moved within. They were patient. Calculating. They would not rush in recklessly, not against a man with a gun, not against prey that could fight back. But they would not leave either. Not until they got what they came for. Jack lifted his rifle, sighting down the barrel, his breath steady despite the hammering of his pulse. He could end it now. A single shot would scatter them, maybe even kill one if his aim was true. But it would not stop them. Not forever. The only way to end this was to make them believe this was not their hunt to win. A low, thunderous growl rumbled behind him. Jack didn't turn. He didn't need to. he knew Brutus had risen. The bear stepped onto the porch, his massive form blocking the firelight spilling from the cabin. His breath steamed in the freezing air, his golden eyes locked onto the wolves. He was still injured, still stiff, but there was no weakness in him now. There was only fury. Jack felt the shift before he heard it, the way the wolves tensed, the way their eyes flicked from the man with the gun to the beast beside him. They had come expecting something broken. Something easy. Instead, they had found something that refused to fall. The silver wolf at the front took a step forward. Testing. Challenging. Brutus roared. The sound split the air like a crack of thunder, a deep, primal thing that sent snow shaking from the branches overhead. It was not the sound of a creature waiting to die. It was the sound of something that had decided it would not be taken. The wolves hesitated. Their leader stood his ground, but the others wavered, shifting uneasily, ears flicking back. They had expected fear. They had found none. Jack took a step forward, lifting the rifle, his voice low, steady. Go. The silver wolf snarled, but it was weaker now. Uncertain. The pack was waiting for a decision, waiting for their leader to tell them if this was worth the risk. Jack could see it in the way they shifted, the way their hunger warred with their survival instincts. Brutus growled again, stepping fully onto the snow, his massive frame blocking the doorway. Jack knew then that the bear had made his own decision. He would not run. He would fight. And if it came to that, so would Jack. The silver wolf held his ground for a long moment. Then, finally, he turned. One by one, the others followed, melting back into the trees, their dark shapes vanishing into the endless white. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the last of them was gone, the forest swallowing them whole. The only sound left was the wind whispering through the trees, the faint creak of ice settling under the weight of morning. Jack let out a breath. Brutus rumbled low in his chest, his golden eyes still locked on the place where the wolves had stood. He was breathing hard, his body still not fully healed, but there was something triumphant in the way he stood. Something unshaken. Jack turned to him, nodding once. Looks like you're staying. The bear blinked. Then, slowly, he lowered himself back onto all fours. He did not go inside. He did not need to. The fight was over. And he was still here. Jack watched him for a long moment, then stepped back into the cabin, leaving the door open. If Brutus wanted to leave, he would. But he didn't. Days passed. The wolves did not return. The snow deepened. The winter stretched on, and life fell into a rhythm Jack hadn't expected. He hunted. He built. He spoke, not because he expected answers, but because it felt less strange than silence. Brutus listened because that was what he did. He never tried to leave. Not fully. Sometimes he would disappear for hours, wandering into the woods. But he always came back. Always. Jack didn't know what to make of it, this understanding between them, this wordless thing that had formed in the cold, in the silence, in the shared defiance of those who had tried to take what they did not own. But he did not question it either. Some things were not meant to be understood. Some things simply were. The world had changed in small, imperceptible ways. The cabin, once a place of solitude, no longer felt empty. The land, once his alone, was shared. And Jack, a man who had spent years chasing silence, found that maybe, just maybe, he had never truly wanted it at all. One evening, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered against the walls, Jack sat on the porch, his rifle resting beside him, the cold pressing against his skin. Brutus lay nearby, his great head resting on his paws, his breath slow, steady. Jack exhaled, staring into the trees, into the endless white beyond. For the first time in a long time, he was not waiting for something to end. For the first time, he was simply here.